It's a great pleasure and honor to be addressing the Nigerian Association of Agricultural Economics. And I'm focusing today in my talk on the quiet revolution in food systems in Africa and Asia. And I want to say on one side why I'm talking about Africa and Asia, and maybe not just Nigeria, but maybe in general, Africa and Asia, is that I feel that there are many points of comparison and similarity. In fact, when I started to work in Nigeria just a couple of years ago, I remember waking up, I was observing what was happening. I was in Ibadan and I was observing the way the food system was changing, the economy was changing, and I said, am I still in Southeast Asia or am I in Africa? And I rubbed my eyes, I said, wait, no, I am in Africa. And I felt like the kinds of things that I was observing were so extremely similar to what I've been watching in Asia. Now, of course, I worked in Africa for years, 25 years ago, 20 years ago, and then I've seen the massive changes that have occurred in West Africa over that time, but also the similarity to Asia. So it's worth comparing. And the second thing is I'm emphasizing a revolution in food systems. And I think that this is very important for researchers to grab onto and think about are these episodes of very rapid change that are occurring in the emerging market economies and driven by confluences of factors like urbanization, diet change, change in infrastructure, all these things happening together that are giving rise to hyper-rapid episodes of endogenous growth. And those are among the most exciting things that one can study today, and I'll focus on them. And also they're exciting because a lot of conventional wisdoms and myths and things that are held dear about what's happening are ideas generated from a situation that I think is basically changed. And it's remembering a traditional economy that now is in transition or modernization very quickly, and so there's a lot of hypotheses to test to understand these changes. And the third one is to think about this transformation. Even though I said I was working in West Africa a lot 25 years ago and living for years in West Africa, and now here, it hasn't been over the 25 years a gradual change. It hasn't been like a slow build-up and then say, oh, it seems to be changing a little bit. No, in fact, the changes that one sees both in Africa and in Asia have not been gradual. They're much more like a tidal wave. A tidal wave, if you know about tsunamis or tidal waves, they start just a few inches high for 1,000 miles in the ocean, ripple. Slowly, okay, they're moving quickly, but they're not high. As they approach the continental shelf, they well up 50 feet. And then the change becomes extremely obvious and strong. That's what I'm seeing in many of the change processes, like I'll talk about potato cold storages in India today, or the poultry supply chain changes in Nigeria today, are things that happen over 5-10 years. The recent 5-10 years, not slowly and gradually. So that nature of the change is discontinuous, abrupt, non-linear, is central to this talk. And if we step back and we think about what has been the stages of value chain transformation, we can think of it as having two sets of changes. One is going from the traditional food systems to the transitional. So this is one step, which we call in our work the quiet revolution, which is, it's not known that it's happening because a lot of focus in terms of changes is focused on the second one, which is the modern revolution, going from the transitional to modern, the supermarket revolution. And so I'm very fascinated by this initial transformation from the traditional to the transitional. I'm interested in it because it's been less discussed in the literature, but I'm also interested in it because, in fact, I think that it's what's happening in approximately 2/3 of African and Asian food systems, and will be a main characteristic over the next couple decades of the food system transformation. And that quiet revolution is essentially a grassroots, small and medium enterprise revolution all along the supply chain. The second revolution is the one that's going from a transitional food system to the modern stage. And this is really the modern revolution, where you have a rise of large processors, supermarkets are spreading, etc. And while this is very important in an emerging phenomenon, I think it still only covers about 1/3 of African and Asian food systems in any given country. It's there in Nigeria, but not dominant yet. It's well along in Asia, it's emerging in Africa, and I think it's very important to study. But I'll focus today on the quiet revolution, partly because it's less discussed in the literature now, and it's 2/3 of the food systems. And when I say 2/3 of the food systems, I'm thinking about the fact that in any given country like Nigeria, there's a coexistence and a parallelism of traditional. You can find traditional food systems fragmented and local in various more hinterland places away from the road, etc. But then the dominant food system is this longer urban-rural supply chains that we're finding, and then just emerging is the modern. So that you see them all at the same time, depending on what zone you're in and what product you're looking at. We'll focus in on the transitional. Now, one of the reasons, or let's say, not one of the reasons, the main reason that the revolutions, let's say the quiet revolution, is occurring so extremely quickly and recently is because it's not caused just by one thing or a second thing. It's caused by a confluence. If you think of that Latin word of confluence, means the flowing together of many rivers. When several rivers flow together, the resultant river is a very rapid paced river with a great deal of volume. And so there's been several trends that have been occurring in Africa and Asia that are causing this rapid and sudden change. One are a set of meta drivers, like income growth, policy liberalization, public infrastructure investment, maybe more in Asia than in Africa, but happening. And then a massive private investment. And people always think about private investment as foreign direct investment. A company comes in, Nestle comes into Nigeria, or big level domestic, Dangote or some big company that makes investments. But there's also a set of thousands of smaller firms and medium firms that are making investment that I think in aggregate are much more than the Nestle's and the Dangotes when you put it all together as an aggregate. And so there's this wave of investment that's occurring, partly related to these. And then of course there's technology change and transfer in each segment of the supply chain, and cross-cutting changes like internet. So these are meta drivers. Then there's 5 transformations that are occurring together that are reinforcing each other. For example, downstream, if you think of it as like a train, pulling the food system downstream is urbanization. Think about Nigeria in 1970, maybe 20% or 15% of the population is in cities. Now it's 50%. And if you think about the food economy, maybe 65 to 70% of all food consumed in Nigeria is consumed in cities. That's a massive change in a short time. And the diets, of course, are changing with a shift toward beyond grain products, processed foods, fruits and vegetables, meat, fish, and dairy. These are all basic changes that are occurring in the diet that work by Sowida, Liverpool, Tassier, and others has documented. And that train is pulled, but it's facilitated by changes that are occurring along the train in the midstream and downstream. There's a transformation of what I call the hidden middle, things that are hidden even from the debate. We just recently did with Sowida 1,500 maize traders in Nigeria, maybe the first and largest large-scale detailed survey of wholesalers in Africa in 100 years. And it's so shocking in a sense that way, that something so important that might be 60–70% of the food system is only now coming on the radar screen to be discussed. And this hidden middle, and hidden from the debate, not missing middle, hidden middle, involves processing, wholesale, logistics, both large firms and small and medium enterprises. and of course retail change, supermarket revolution, fast food chains. All of these food system elements are changing and reacting to and supplying an urbanizing market and a set of diets that are changing. And then of course feeding this train, it's like coal going into the engine, is farming intensification upstream, commercialization of farms, diversification of farms, and input value chain development. I'll focus a little bit less on this today, and I'll focus more on what's happening in the midstream. Now, these changes that we see are causing a modern revolution in value chains with the foreign direct investment, the rise of the large processors and wholesalers, the big feed companies. But I'll focus in on the quiet revolution in the hidden middle. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, this change of even the rise of these small and medium enterprises in the midstream of the supply chain have been very sudden and fast. And this has been driven not by foreign direct investment, not by government investment, but by investments in domestic markets and by domestic firms. And a lot of what we found in our surveys that have revealed these amazing changes have come up from what we call stack surveys. So instead of doing what many people do in our business, where you do a detailed farm survey and then you just go and do a few key informant interviews with the midstream actors, instead we do full surveys of the midstream actors, like a full survey of the traders, full surveys of the processors, to allow us to test rigorously econometric propositions. And we found sets, if you think of looking at food system change in terms of structural conduct and performance change. Structure, conduct, performance is a normal paradigm that economists have used for a long time to think about food system changes. We can focus first on the structural changes that have been occurring. One that's very interesting and important is that food systems in Africa and Asia have shifted from being local food systems where the farmers locally sell just to the village. In fact, the share of what they're selling just within their local domain has dropped a lot over a short time, and now you have longer and longer supply chains, okay? And you know that there's going to be longer supply chains because you have an urban share of food is 60–70%, so you're going to have these long. And then secondly, you're finding there's a diversification in value added in supply chains driven by diet change. As I said, there's been a rapid increase in the share of processed food and of non-grain foods in the diet. And then the most spectacular change that's occurred structurally is you've gone from maybe a dearth of midstream firms or a presence of parastatals that's dominated it, to the proliferation of tens of thousands of small and medium enterprises in processing, in wholesale, in the third-party logistics services. And we found, for example, in the work with Soida, that 85% of all of the maize moved by wholesalers in Nigeria is moved not by trucks owned by the wholesalers, but rather a very active third-party logistics transport sector that's emerged. And how many studies have been done on that sector? We found zero, okay, and yet it's extremely central. And also the rise of, besides third-party logistics, warehouses, cold storages, etc., and I'll come back to cold storages. An example of a structural change can be seen in Bangladesh aquaculture. And we're also studying aquaculture in the case of Nigeria, and similar things are happening. But look at this amazing change that's occurred. There's been a 1,500% increase in aquaculture production over 25 years. It's gone from just 30% of fish consumption to 70% of fish consumption. So you see this supply chain spreading out. And within that, you found a 600% increase in the fish feed segment in just 10 years. Now, what's eerie and interesting is I'm going to name that same number for the Nigerian feed sector increase. So that's another one of those parallelisms between Asia and Africa that's so interesting. And look at the segments within the middle. As the supply chain is increasing, the farms are increasing, you've actually have a 300% increase in just 10 years in the number of small and medium enterprises in this hidden middle: wholesalers, hatcheries, logistics. So it's a ferment of change. And all of this is being driven not by, as often people think, export market. Many times in many countries I've worked in, people say if something's changing, it's because the export market is changing, okay, or because of maybe a multinational firm is changing the market. In fact, all of this gigantic change that's occurring in this system and many of the other food systems we're studying in Asia and Africa are all driven by the domestic market, not exports. Another example that's parallel, and I put it on purpose here as parallel, is the Nigerian poultry complex, meaning the chicken production, feed production, and maize production together. And one of the things that's fascinating is to see that this industry that used to be more or less a backyard production, letting chickens run free and peck and hunt and peck and live from waste, etc., has become a fully developed supply chain stretching over all of Nigeria from north to south, 1,500 kilometers. Almost all of the maize and feed is moving along that long corridor. And that feed itself as a sector has grown enormously. Look at the number. It's the same number as we said in Bangladesh, which is considered one of the fastest changing and growing situations in the world. You see 600% increase in maize-based feed in the past 10 years. And all of that, again, is in a sector where it's not the changes being driven by imports, by exports, nor is it a sector that's dominated by imports. A lot of the debate in Nigeria has been this assumption that imports are absolutely dominant and in chicken, and then the domestic sector is just small. Actually, it's the opposite. The import share we've calculated at 15%. 85% of the chicken in Nigeria is produced by these rapidly developing supply chains. And they aren't just produced by men or in the South. We found a huge participation of women in small and medium enterprises and farms in northern Nigeria. They're selling to small towns and secondary cities. This is a shared, participatory, grassroots chicken and egg revolution in Nigeria that's every bit as dynamic as anything I've seen anywhere in Asia. Now, when you find such a rapid structural change, you're bound to also find changes in the conduct of the food system. I'll just give you a few examples that really strike us. One of them is that there's a long-held, dearly held, I would say, assumption that is present in the debate, both in Africa and Asia, that there's exploitative behavior by traders who come in and advance money to farmers there, and then forcing them that way to sell the product to them to the trader at the end of the season, and extracting a usurious rent from them or profit by having an interest rate, an implicit interest rate in that trader loan that is deleterious to the farmers. And so in Asia, we did about 15,000 interviews with traders, with farmers, etc. And we found that only 2% of both traders and farmers are involved in such kinds of tied credit. Even though in every audience I've been in Africa and Asia, everybody, when I say this tied credit exists, they're all saying, yes, yes, this is absolutely the way things work. Actually, it doesn't work that way even in Africa, which you might consider to be in a more traditional situation. No, we found that only about 3% of all transactions and actors in a study of 8,000 farm households took part in receiving advances from traders during the season. And so this is a very important result and overturning of conventional wisdom, because in both Africa and Asia, people would often cite this idea of the traders holding in thrall the farmers with this exploitative activity, slowing down the transformation of the supply chain, not giving farmers the chance to face a competitive trade sector. But when I've said this, for example, in India to a trader, he said that people think that they're still using the tied credit market and that it's disappeared. He said, what are you talking about? Of course it's disappeared. Are you talking about my grandfather's time? They did it then, but now farmers have rural non-farm employment. In Nigeria, rural non-farm employment is about 60% or 70% of total income of rural households, okay, and most of the cash. So that the cash is now available from these other sources and they aren't dependent on the traders. The road network has increased, there's competition among the traders. So this basic mainstay of the traditional food system conduct has withered away in both Africa and Asia. We also found that there's a shift from the traditional rural brokers to town-based wholesalers combined with third-party logistics services. Again, a basic kind of conduct change. And as I mentioned earlier, another assumption about conduct was that maize traders were using their own transport, but in fact you have this tremendous increase in third-party logistics. There's also, of course, widespread technology changes, things that are not high-tech technologies with satellites and internet, etc. The basic main changes that are occurring in these systems are ones like shifting from pastures to use of feed, from capture systems to enclosure, for example, in aquaculture, chicken coops, and rapid development of input supply chains. This is something that really shocked us in our in-depth study of poultry in Nigeria. We found that 40% of small chicken farmers in Nigeria are using vitamins and antibiotics. This is small chicken farmers, okay? So they've even shifted their behavior. Of course, the medium and large chicken farmers are already using them, but it's more this penetration into the smallholders that's a sign of the revolution. Only 10% of chicken farmers in the south of Nigeria are producing traditionally the hunt and peck system. 90% of these farmers, small farmers, are using feed, either that they buy the ingredients and then compose them, or they're buying commercial feed. The backyard system has changed dramatically, right under our eyes. And then in the north, it's a little bit more traditional, but look at how much it's changing. Sure, 65% of the small farmers are using the traditional system of raising chickens, but already 35% are using feed. This is a clear sign of change. If you look at Bangladesh, it's also very similar to southern Nigeria. Look at the similarity. 80% of Bangladesh small fish farmers use commercial feed. Okay, so these are not two different worlds. There's convergence Asia, Africa in terms of these kinds of changes. Now, to end my talk, I want to give you an example that's very dear to my heart of how quickly something can change and so different from conventional wisdom and driven by this confluence of factors that we talked about. And if you go, many of you might know in your mind, you think of India, you think of the beautiful Taj Mahal, okay? In Taj Mahal is in a place called Agra, which is about 3-4 hours from Delhi, through very difficult traffic, okay? Traffic that makes anything I've seen in Nigeria look like Switzerland, okay? But basically, what we found is that there's been a gigantic boom in potato cold storages in 1 decade, okay? And before we started this work, this is what I love to do, because we've done this somewhat in Nigeria, okay, where we'll come to the Ogas and we'll come to the government people and we'll say, what is the situation in this sector, okay? And then there'll usually be a pretty strong response. In the case of India, we said, are there cold storages sector development in potato, the main vegetable crop in India? And they said, it's very sad, but there's nothing. There's nothing happening. Only a few foreigners are putting them in. Otherwise, it's all traditional storage. And therefore, we have extreme seasonality and very high prices related to our potatoes because we're simply missing this, okay? Have they done that? Any recent surveys on that? No, but they held that strongly. And so that was what dominated the debate. We went out and we did a very careful survey in this area of farmers and cold storages and traders. And we found the extreme opposite of the conventional wisdom. Where the conventional wisdom was completely correct 10 years ago, or 10 years before the survey. 10 years before the survey, 99% of the farmers used traditional storage. Okay, a little bit of straw on the potatoes, they stored it for a few months and then it either went bad or they sold it. So there was extreme seasonality. Only 1% of the farmers in that area used cold storage. So that was the image stuck in the mind of the policymakers and the OGA in the research community. When we went and did our survey, we found 1% of the farmers were using traditional methods. 99% now used modern cold storages. Okay, and it was caused by a cascade of events that occurred over 10 years, a confluence of changes. The first one was the introduction in the late 1980s, early 1990s, very far-sighted, of some public investment in a new potato variety that was more resistant to disease, but also had thicker skin, could store longer and be transported further. Farmers were shifting from wheat to potato because of this new potato available, and there were public investment subsidies in water pumps that some of the farmers got, not many, but there was a shift toward irrigation, and there was certainly a shift toward this new kind of potato. And all that was encouraged by initial growth in the Delhi economy after structural adjustment, liberalization, income started to change. Now, you have to think about, when I say the word Delhi, you have to think about what I mean, okay? Delhi is about 20 million people, and then the area around Delhi is about another 20 million people. That together is the size of France, okay, in population, France. So if you think that France would change its income and its consumption patterns very rapidly over 10 years or 20 years, that's the situation that's happening in India. And this potato zone near there, and it's happening in Nigeria. You think Lagos, Ibadan, these places are changing very rapidly and growing, very huge magnets of change. And that diffusion of the urbanization effect that occurs from those changes is just like dominoes going out and affecting rural areas. It affects them, of course, more where there's rural roads that are linking the areas. And diet diversification, then, the consumption of potatoes rapidly rising in these large urban areas is driving the shifts in the production zone. Third, there was a rise of this rural non-farm employment that I was talking about, especially in the market shed of Delhi. It's driving up farm and non-farm wages, and those wages are then going into private investment. This is something Saweet has shown for how inputs are financed in Nigeria, mainly by rural non-farm employment, okay? And so this money's going into it, and they're starting to make investments, not just on the farm in pumps, but also in buying cold storage operations and in trucks, okay? So you just think the money's flowing like a river into these investments. And the public sector then does something essential that speeds all of it up. It puts it in an energy grid. And also some limited subsidies for cold storages, but in fact, that's very minor. It was an extremely minor, 5% of the cold storage is coming from that. The main thing is that by enabling this change, the government did a kind of jujitsu. It helped along a private investment process that was already occurring. So what did we find? We found that with those conditions in place at the farm level, the midstream level, the infrastructure level, there was massive private investment in cold storages starting in the late 1990s and then crescendoing over just when we were starting. And this is very similar to Kebbi State, for example, in the fish work that we were doing. In Yauri, you find that there's a tremendous doubling of fish farmers, you know, in just a 10-year period. It's a similar kind of rapid, unexpected, sudden growth that's occurring, and its implications were that potatoes in Delhi shifted from a seasonal consumption to nearly year-round consumption, and 2/3 of it coming from cold storages now versus 10, 15 years ago when almost none of it came from cold storages. And of course then there were knock-on effects of this. What is the conclusion of this talk? The conclusion is that we as agricultural economists have to see that the countries that we're working in, including Nigeria, are living a dual revolution in the hidden middle, this 60% of the supply chain, driven by a confluence of things that's occurring that's making it all move along at an extremely rapid pace. It's disruptive in its speed. It's like a tidal wave, recent, abrupt, fast. It's something new to study. is disruptive in its changes of structures, its institutions, it changes in technologies. And it's crucial to research this phenomenon, not just from the point of view of one given sector, like farm studies only, but begin to open it up and study it as an entire food system and understand its the consumption side, the midstream changing, the farms changing, the input value change changing, all as one integrated set of transformations of the African economy and also of the Asian economy. Thank you very much.